Today, I blew my son's college fund on this bootleg model of a Soviet super battleship from AliExpress. Hey kids, my name's Fring, but you can call me Boxman. This one's gonna need a little context, so here it goes. I was doing my weekly grocery shopping on AliExpress when this peculiar item caught my eye. Soviet Union 1700 Kremlin Battleship Ship Toys Assembled Model Toys Hobby.
What in tarnation?
For those of you who don't dabble in naval history or cocaine, that's the Project 24 battleship, which was intended to follow up the never-completed Sovietsky-Soyuz class battleships in the late 1940s to 50s. These ships would have been massive, with some designs coming close to modern nuclear supercarriers in terms of displacement at 100,000 tons. For reference, the Yamato, which was by far the largest battleship ever built, displaced roughly 70,000 tons at full load. Unsurprisingly, the designers probably dabbled in the latter of the aforementioned subjects. And along with battleships becoming somewhat obsolete, Project 24 was never built. Buying a niche and expensive product from AliExpress has got to be one of the most extreme forms of gambling. It's got 5 total sales and a whopping 4 reviews, 3 of which were probably from one guy named Dylan. If this isn't setting off any alarm bells, you might be related to a wealthy Nigerian prince who needs your help because you're just asking to get scammed. I went ahead and bought it anyways. Luckily for me, it came as advertised. Kids, do not go trying this at home. I do not condone gambling despite suffering from it. Feast your eyes on the future of scale modeling. The entire model kit is 3D printed in resin. As a result, the details on some of these parts are superior to anything you can have in traditional plastic kits, especially Rebelle. Just look at that radar. Oh my goodness gracious. The downside to 3D resin is that it's got about as much structural integrity as the skull of a newborn, from personal experience. Plus, you can clearly see some layer lines and leftover support marks on the whole model. A few parts already got damaged during shipping, but luckily the fellas who made the kit included extra parts. How generous. Anyways, I've padded the runtime enough. Let's get crack-a-lackin'. I am so fucking sorry. The first thing I noticed were these big gaping drainage holes. They're for the 3D printing process only, so I need to plug them up with some putty. I used Tamiya's white putty, but I wouldn't recommend it for huge gaping holes like this, as it shrank significantly over time. While I wait for the putty to dry, I get on with removing the parts from their supports, starting with the beautiful yet fragile mass. It's kind of like trying to disarm one of those bombs with the red and blue wires. Except there's a million wires, they're all the same color, and the bomb is going to go off even if you don't cut the wrong wire because it's just that fragile. I'd honestly take the bomb over this because one way or another, I wouldn't have to deal with the consequences of screwing up. After a certain point, I've had enough and start defying the laws of physics by ripping the mass out with my hands without causing much damage. I'd chalk this up to sheer dumb luck. Whatever I'm doing, make sure you do the exact reverse opposite on your own bootleg AliExpress model boats. The rest of the parts can be simply ripped out of the grasp of their supports without worry or consequence. Briefly dunking them in boiling water will deal a great blow to their morale, making the process quite satisfying. With that done, the putty from earlier has solidified sufficiently, and I can now move on to sanding the specs of the ship's surface smooth. Subscribe and share the video with your sister. The hull appears to be as smooth as my big greasy noggin. Just gonna brush off this Colombian powder off the model. We'll call it, flour. A Boxman build is incomplete without a healthy dose of mistakes. I thought that the superstructure was looking a little too plain and needed some more panel lines. In my infinite wisdom, I decided that stretch sprue would be the best way to accomplish this desire. Basically, you take some leftover sprues and hold them over a flame until the plastic starts to melt, before pulling them apart to form thin strings of plastic. My big blunder was that I haphazardly globbed on super glue, thinking that I was gonna just wash the excess away with debonder, all willy-nilly with the sun smiling in the top right corner. Unfortunately, we live in a cruel world. The big man upstairs seems intent on foiling my schemes, this time being no different. What I thought would be a neat little trick ended with the familiar sinking feeling of disappointment. I could have ripped it all off and sanded the surface, but that runs the risk of further damaging the model. Whoops. It feels wrong not having to assemble anything before it's already time to start painting. This kit lacks the satisfaction of putting everything together yourself. It's just not the same. It's like having dessert before the main course, or attending a funeral that you didn't cause. It's time to start priming. I got myself some black Mr. Surfacer to coat the entire model in. This will prepare the surface for painting and also reveals imperfections which I will remove depending on how lazy I'm feeling at the time. The primer has helpfully revealed this strange texture on the hull. It's almost as if this model was a video game asset. Given what we've seen thus far, I'm now 97.38% certain that the people who made this model kit ripped the 3D model from the game World of Warships, modified it, and then 3D printed it. Hold on, my lawyer is calling me. Hey Tyrus, what's up? Yes. I see. Well, it was nice catching up. Tell Bertram I said hi. What a guy. Don't know what that was about. This, on the other hand, is about sanding down the strangely polygonal texture on the hull. Haha, looks like it's made of wood. That's because I'm going to add my own panel lines to the hull using the good old masking tape and primer strat. With how complicated the hull shape is, and the fact that it's got brittle railings running along the length, I had a really hard time getting the tape where I wanted it to go. This time around, I'm going to have two distinct layers of paneling. The first is going to be the ship's armored belt on the sides, which I mask off separately for spraying. Halfway through, my spray can ran out of blood, so I switched to my trusty airbrush as my weapon of choice to finish the job. Once a nice and thick layer of primer has been deposited, please remove the tape. Congratulations, the ship now has an armored belt. Now I need to do the same thing for the rest of the ship. In order to get nice, pronounced panel lines on the hull, I need to lay the primer down in a generously thick coat. That way it forms a raised edge where the primer meets the masking tape. Just don't be a goofy goober and dip your fingers into the still wet primer while holding the ship. Peeling tape is pretty satisfying, and the music's quite nice, so I'll shut up for a few seconds. The result could have been a little better. Some primer spilled underneath the tape, and I also broke a ton of railings, which I didn't plan for. Fortunately, like in the real world, whatever mistakes you do make can be covered up with a little resourcefulness and a lot of dirt. More on that later. Now it's time to start painting for real. As usual, I start with the wooden deck. I like to employ a special technique where I use tape to mask off hundreds of individual wooden planks with a bunch of different colors in an attempt to make a convincing looking wood effect. I start off with a dark reddish brown, which will serve as the darkest colored wood planks. In between spraying each color is when I add the masking tape. I bought the 0.5mm tape from AliExpress because I was too lazy to cut the 1mm tape in half. Just masking the planks is quite the laborious task, but it's merely dipping your pinky toes into the water compared to the hell that will follow. Rinse and repeat the process of painting and taping as many times as you see fit. I chose to apply 3 layers total. After all of that, it's time to remove all the masking and see if the end result justifies the effort. At long last, the wooden deck is somewhat convincing, if I do say so myself. This might be a total fluke, but I'm very happy with the way it turned out. The tape lifted off some paint, but it's no big deal. I also engraved a very non-threatening message into the model. You should do what it says. Now that our toes are nice and moist, it's time our balls got the same treatment. I'm attempting to mask the entire ship's deck with pieces of masking tape. Because the deck is attached to the hull, which I will paint using an airbrush, it's best that I mask everything right now. There's no easy way out of this. This little forward section alone took me 3 hours and allowed me to spray the non-slip metal at the nose of the ship. While I'm at it, I paint all other parts that have brown surfaces too, which I'll mask later. Let's be for real on God right now. You don't want to see 8 hours of masking tape footage, and my phone doesn't have enough storage for that anyways. Let's just skip ahead in 3, 2, 1, bazinga. Nice. Now it's the hull's turn to get painted. The first thing I do is spray white paint where the boot stripe lies and mask it off using 0.5mm tape. I want to try to create an effect known as tin canning using a painting technique called pre-shading. In pre-shading, you use black and white paint to create shadows and highlights on the model, which will show through the final color if it's the right opacity. Admittedly, my work here is really sloppy. In my defense, it was 3 a.m. and I was rushing to finish the base coat before the weekend was over. On top of that, tin canning doesn't actually look like this. So don't use this as a guide because I frankly don't know what the fuck I'm doing. With the hull pre-shaded, I mask off the top and mix up a deep purplish red for the ship's bottom. The paint has to be slightly transparent for the pre-shading to work, so I mixed in about 50% clear gloss. I wasn't sure how much paint I was going to use for the ship's upper works, so I cooked up a huge batch of Soviet blue entirely by eyeballing. Just don't ask me for the paint ratios because only God knows. I used my mystery mixture of blue to paint the hull, as well as the remaining parts of the kit. The keen-eyed among you will notice that this footage looks different, and you'd be correct. It's because I took a 2-month break from building this model and picked up some better lighting equipment in the meantime. Anyways, my footage is all out of whack, so we'll snap back to February 2024 for now. Just in time for the ultimate reveal. I take great enjoyment in personally evicting each and every single piece of them, gosh darned, good for nothing, freeloading pieces of masking tape. The ship's white boot stripe has several imperfections which need to be corrected. After masking off the surrounding area and hitting it with white paint, it looks acceptable. Finally, the base coat application is now complete. Before I can start making the ship look rusty and badass, I just need to do a few minor touch-ups. By hand? Lord have mercy, I'm so scared. Oh shit, oh fuck, why do I do this at 3 a.m.? I hope you can understand why I use my airbrush to paint whenever possible. I'm trying to improve, but at the moment my dexterity is about on par with Big Mouth Billy Bass. It would be unreasonable to mask each of these details for airbrushing, so I have no choice but to man up and paint them by hand. Sure, I'll make plenty of mistakes, but as long as I enjoy the process and learn from them, then they're mistakes worth making. Am I giving off Bob Ross vibes? It's time I addressed all the broken railings. I should have replaced them with metal ones from the start, but I have some leftovers from another project I was working on, so I'll just patch up the broken sections. First, any partially broken railings need to get completely snapped off. Then I'm forced to partner with my arch nemesis, super glue, to secure the replacement railings. I left a few extra bars on the replacements so they had more surface area to get glue on. It looks all right from afar, but the metal railings are noticeably thinner. To finish up the hull, I slapped a freakishly saturated bronze color onto the propellers. They'll hopefully be toned down by weathering later. One last thing before I start weathering, I need to assemble the parts of the superstructure. The kit doesn't have any instructions, so I use World of Warships as my reference. At long last, here's the part I've been edging you guys to. This decrepit-looking bottle was the first modeling paint I ever bought, all the way back in 2017. It's still good, so I mixed it with Tamiya's brown panel liner to wash the deck in, to accentuate all the panels of the wood. Capillary action, my brother from another mother, is what makes this possible. He forcefully coerces the panel liner into even the tightest of crevices, and for that, I am eternally grateful. For the rest of the ship, I applied Tamiya's black panel liner onto the details. Once it's dried, I'll blend it away using enamel thinner, which creates more contrast in the paint job. It's easy to overdo this and flood the entire surface with paint, which is not very muy bien since it makes it harder to blend the excess. You can see what I'm talking about on this turret, which got completely covered in panel liner, making its color too dark even after removing most of it. The deck wash ended up looking too light when it dried, so I went back with the black wash and used it wherever the wood met with any kind of fixture. This hopefully makes the wood look more worn in the places where people would be walking around and doing stuff on. After the panel washes, I like to do some further shading using Winsor and Newton oil paints. I used way too much paint on the superstructure, which overwhelmed the previous layers of shading after blending it. What I was supposed to do was dot the paint really lightly and blend it away to create subtle discoloration, which I did a better job of with the ship's hull, having learnt my lesson. Turpenoid comes in handy since it blends oil paints without affecting enamels. It's also smelling mighty refreshing, so don't mind if I do. With the shading done on the hull and superstructure, I'm still not satisfied. This is a hypothetical Soviet super battleship, and I want it to look visually punchier, if that makes sense. My solution? Dry brushing. You put a little paint on a paintbrush and unload as much as possible into a paper towel. Then you take the paintbrush and dab away as much paint as you can until it's basically dry, hence the name. The second step was optional. Take your dry brush and carefully brush over the entire surface. Any protrusions will be picked out, increasing the amount of highlights. I found that dry brushing worked especially well for the ship's turrets, which have tons of small details and sharp edges that get highlighted really nicely. However, I definitely should have used a darker color since the white highlights are a bit too strong, but I'm still prouder of this than I am of my son. Just kidding, I'm not proud of my son. Speaking of things I'm not proud of, the life rafts. Luckily, I can repaint them. They look unnaturally bright, but I'll apply one final black wash after I've assembled the entire model. Wait, is that what I think it is? Oh my God. Holy crap, guys, take a gander. This poor fella crawled onto my table when I didn't notice and died right underneath my cutters. I'll name him Dylan. Nobody should have to die alone like that. The least I can do is give Dylan a proper burial. He lived a hard life writing all those AliExpress reviews. Godspeed, Dylan, your soul lives on. Let's finish up this build. It's what Dylan would have wanted. I used super glue to secure all components of the ship. There aren't really any other alternate adhesives for resin kits. First up for the weapons are these anti-aircraft guns, which I had fixed to sticky balls. They're small and pretty well detailed. All that's needed to restrain them is a small droplet of glue. Again, the kit doesn't have instructions, so I used World of Warships as my instructions. Next up, this ball of little cranes. Fuck. Larger anti-aircraft mount. Them dual-purpose guns, I presume. I'm realizing now that I'm short 2 of the small AA guns. There should be 18, but the kit only includes 16. That's strange, considering it included plenty of extras for the other guns. Before I can make this pristine ship look crusty and disgusting, I need to seal my hard work with a gloss clear coat. For some minor final touches before the yucky stuff, I apply a black wash to the unnaturally bright rafts, so they don't look like they were photoshopped onto the ship. The reason I'm doing this after clear coating is because I didn't want them to affect the previous layer of oil paint. Apparently this section here is supposed to have windows, so I did my best to mask the area before painting it by hand. To hide how messy the windows look, I added some panel liner to draw your attention to the panel line directly above. With all that stuff done and dusted, it's time to make this ship properly Soviet. Soviet and Russian machinery looks hella aesthetic when it's borderline rotting away, so it'd be a huge missed opportunity if I didn't weather the shit out of this model. For the rust streaks, I used Winsor & Newton's burnt sienna oil paint over the white streaks I made previously, which helps the rust stand out a little more. My rule of thumb for rust is to add it wherever there's different shapes intersecting or where things are hanging over the side of the ship. I do a first pass with blended rust streaks, followed up by unblended rust splotches, as shown here on the ship's asshole. My USS Washington video deeply traumatized me when it comes to weathering a ship's underside, and I've been working up the courage to try it again. I start off by creating some sandy-colored dirt or sediment buildup. This is what I had in mind back then when I said, whatever mistakes you do make can be covered up with a little resourcefulness and a lot of dirt. I'm giving the paint some texture by stippling my paintbrush. Instead of letting the paint dry for 2 weeks, I waited about an hour for it to firm up before catching the bastard off guard and wiping it away using vertical streaks and some more stippling. This actually worked pretty well with the panel lines on the hull, which caught the dirt along its edges, creating a cool effect. Before I'm able to get a rematch with the dreaded algae, I once again gloss coat the model to protect the previous layer of paint. This time I created 2 distinct layers for the algae. The first is a thin, yellowish green color that looks pretty subtle when dry. The second layer is a deeper green, which I apply carefully right below the white boot stripe. All in all, I'm super happy with how the weathering turned out. It could be better, but at least I'm not scared to do it anymore. Would any of you notice or care if I forgot to paint the little boats? I'm not saying I did forget them, but I was enjoying myself until I saw them sitting in my parts container. To my dismay, I can't knowingly ignore them. Otherwise, I'll get in trouble for this thing called child abuse. The boats are complete and can now be glued onto the ship's deck. That does it for the assembling portion of this build. The model is very shiny, so I'll use a flat clear coat to achieve a matte finish. Fun fact, this is what I looked like when I was a championship swimmer. It's time for some rigging. This is my first time attempting rigging of any kind, so I'm absolutely terrified. Half the line coming jumbled up in this amalgamation before it even left the box isn't a good sign. What really surprised me was how hard it is to see this stuff. I was definitely a little overzealous in stocking up on photo etch upgrade sets and deluxe edition model kits because my eyesight sure ain't getting better. I left way too much tension in these lines, which ended up deforming the weak resin mass. Aw shucks. The signal lines are made from stretched sprue, which are a tad thick but provide a more appropriate color. Performing any operation on rigging has me shitting bricks. All it takes is one tiny mistake to not only destroy the rigging, but the entire model too. I'm just gonna call it quits. It was a good first attempt, but this ship is way too fragile, and my unsuccessful gambling career taught me to quit while I'm still ahead. The model kit doesn't come with any flags, so I bought a whole sheet of them online. These are water slide decals, so you need to soak them in water to get them off the sheet. I place the flags on tinfoil so I can make them look like they're waving in the breeze as the ship rots in harbor, in true Soviet fashion. And that's that. Building this model was a pretty strange experience. Although 90% of my time was spent painting, which is my favorite aspect of scale modeling, the whole build felt tedious to get through. I think it's because my reptilian brain developed a primitive action reward system, wherein I get rewarded with a hit of dopamine only if I finish building something. And because I didn't really build anything, I lacked the juice to power me through. Despite that, I'm quite satisfied with the result, and I'm eager to apply the skills I learned during this build on my future projects. Here's a little size comparison with the only other super battleship model I have, the IJN Yamato. On paper, these two ships are pretty similar. Both displace about 70,000 tons, and both have 18-inch guns, with Yamatos being 3 millimeters larger in diameter. After making 3 mega obese ships back-to-back, it sure is going to be hard to build regular battleships again. As for the kit, I won't be rating it on the Boxman Dick scale. I know, big bummer. I just don't think it's fair, since the manufacturer is pretty shady, and I wouldn't recommend anyone going out and buying these kits. That being said, negative 80,000 points on the Dick scale.